can start. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you our next speaker. Professor James Matthew Wilson is the Cullen Foundation Chair in English Literature at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, where he founded a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from a distinctly Catholic perspective. Prior to being at University of St. Thomas, he taught in the humanities program, I believe, at Villanova University, which now everybody knows because that's where the Pope went. So did my grandfather, who came from Cuba to go to Villanova, so we're very proud of that. And I will say I encountered James as a philosopher, though he really is a poet, and I say really is a poet. As he recounts in the interview I had with him, which is published in my book in the back, it was his love for poetry and the beauty of poetry and the difficulty of finding a creative writing program that allowed him to do the kind of beautiful poetry he wanted to do that he turned to philosophy. So lest he fool you into thinking he's a philosopher, because he sounds like one, he's a poet. So the one public service announcement I will make is I've gotten a couple of questions about buying books in the back. If you have any questions about that, see me. But now to my point about James being a philosopher, although he's professionally a poet. You know, one of the themes we're talking about today is romanticism and its place in the arts. And it turns out, I found out last night that an important part of James's courtship of his life, of his wife, of his beautiful wife who's here, is how good he was at philosophy. So if you want to find out from a poet philosopher how to make philosophy, how to make realist philosophy or realist poetry romantic, you can ask James. With that, I will turn it over to James. Thank you.
I fear you may be in for very steep disappointments, as my wife testified to you. My idea of romance is doing something and then just saying romance afterwards. So thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you, Father, for your hospitality. And Father, to you, thank you also for the hospitality at Wycliffe Hall. If I had one modest suggestion, it might be not to testify early on Tuesday mornings before 8. But anyhow, it's been wonderful to stay there and to be with you all. When I was invited to both give a poetry reading and a lecture, my first impulse was to do what Jacques Maritain does in his book Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry, and to give you a discussion and then follow with, as he puts it in that book, text without comment. And I don't know how many of you know that book. It's rather gargantuan. One of the reasons, at least in its first edition, it's so large, is because there's, after each chapter, a series of poems and extracts that are just presented for the reader's edification, as well as paintings as well. But I know full well that if I begin speaking on the subject of beauty, as I aim to do at some point today, that I will probably crowd out all of the time that was to be allowed for poetry. And so I'm going to start with the poems, give you text more or less without comment, and then in the time that remains to me, offer a few thoughts on beauty that I think will come right out of the discussions that we heard this morning. And I aim to make sure that there's time for questions. So I'll start with, I think I'll read you 5 poems. And I want to start with one that is a translation from Raissa Maritain. So this is, in some respects, is a very exact translation. It follows her verse form, rhyme scheme. I felt obliged. It didn't. Some aspects of it didn't translate terribly well to English, so I do additions here. But I'm not starting with this merely because it's by Raissa. This poem actually, I think, is the nucleus of everything I want to say today. Just what this poem means. It's a poem called De Profundis. God, oh my God, the space between us I cannot endure. Reveal to me that pilgrimage, both absolute and pure, that pathway without wreckage of my soul into your heart. Unlike those men, chart on the earth by number and by part. My soul is plucked and poor, and feels the wound of everything in its unspeakable slap and with its all too human ring. Pain ravished me of my first years, and now I'm just a ghost that goes out moaning for its marrow along roads hard and narrow that hope has forced on it with tears. In justice, my eyes rise towards you, beneath a loneliness whose shadows, darkest headstones, bloodied altars weigh and press. How can I come to you beyond the obscurity of signs? My flesh to meet your light, which blinds all that on which it shines. All that is said of you is sacrilege, and what you say yourself in our tongue seems odd and will not give itself away. For while you shroud yourself in speaking darkness or withdraw, the world you fashioned coruscates with stars that overawe. And the abyss in which you set them terrifies my soul. From those abyssal depths, I cry to you, my God, my goal. It's a poem that reflects on the obscurity of God and the coruscating brilliance of created being, and feels the abyss between them. So I want to follow with a second poem, one whose title comes right from the English spiritual classic, The Cloud of Unknowing, and Beat Upon This High Cloud of Unknowing is the title of the poem. And I think it's important that when I first wrote this poem, and then as I do with most of my poems, recited it to my wife for the first time, she said, yeah, I don't get that. And I think that's part of the reason is to think about why that might be, not about her, but about the poem itself. And beat upon this high cloud of unknowing. After a trek up loose rock, I found myself below the peak, shaking with fears and staggering on my legs. The fog had swallowed the path behind. My memory was hollowed where your and other names belonged. Last year's acanthus blooms wiped out. I hit the ground. I may have slept an hour, I don't know, but when my eyes turned up, they felt the press of a cloud's crushing weight, which blotted all, enshrouded all in that strange dark. I call into the raveling air. My sight grows less the more I strain for light, while I strike blow on blow against the black, whose insubstantial vault resonates like a great drum of steel. You'd not have recognized my voice, its cry. Just let me in, I beg you, or I'll die. Just let me in. And then a final peal of thunder snuffed it out. The circumstantial evidence is plain. I woke with knuckles bleeding, my throat dried to a reed, my head concussed. But just the same, the glowering cloud I fought was buried deeper in me than all thought. My blind and breathless trail an outward husk, and every fist the self itself exceeding. So those two poems are both in my first book of poems, Some Permanent Things, part of a sequence that's actually an exploration of the influence of French poetry on religious thought. And it includes translations in addition to from Raissa, Maritain, from Baudelaire and Verlaine and others. The next poem I wanted to share is from the latest book, St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds, a Dominican book, if there ever was one. And here's a very short poem to begin called Lilacs. You stand beneath the lilac bush at night and smell her heavy blossoms, think, ah, right, I've caught this scent 1,000 times before, which subtle though it is, you can't ignore. It fills the mind and yet escapes it too, as every mystery worth the name will do. Perhaps that's why, like baby faces, ants, the curious innards of a marshland's plants, like love songs or the neighbor's lad you pet, no matter how familiar, we still get a pulse of wonder and a hint of fear that some ethereal visitant draws near. And here is the title poem from this book, St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds. Years ago, reading in the Prima Segunda, in the treatise on law, there's a long exposition on the Mosaic law, where St. Thomas feels obliged to explain to us why Moses proscribed the consumption of so many different kinds of birds, from ostriches to emus, etc. It's a really phenomenal moment in the Summa for a number of reasons, including that it shows Thomas doing typological theology, something that someone once said was inadmissible in scholasticism, obviously false. And also it brings that great medieval phenomenon of scholasticism, that high phenomenon of scholasticism, closer to its another great medieval expression that's you might say is more popular, and that's the bestiary. Anyhow, reading the Summa, I thought these passages from Aquinas are begging to be put into heroic couplets. And I had no intention of writing a poem. I just wanted to hear what Thomas Aquinas would sound like on these birds in heroic couplets. But then by the time I finished, as it were, translating from prose to verse, I could see Aquinas in his room dictating to his amanuenses, and a poem unfolded. St. Thomas and the Forbidden Birds. Beyond the window, morning sparrows made their song as if the whole world's goodness paid its plenty out for them and them alone. The old saint heard their joy and squelched a moan as his legs, stiff and heavy still with sleep, arranged themselves beneath his cassocked heaped buck belly. Where had he left off before? He asked his three amanuenses, more for their sakes, sprightly fingers, sluggish minds, than his. One said, with the forbidden kinds of birds, and what their figures signified for Moses, who charged the eagle's flight with pride. Aquinas sat a moment, mind withdrawn from his mouth's taste of buttered loaves, the dawn without, the wish for more wood in the fire to clear the frost from stone, or to admire the cool, swift brilliance of all he said, as a swan plumes its white and well-turned head. He spoke. The long-beaked ibis feeds on snakes to represent the man whom nothing slakes. Feasting upon dead bodies' opened gore, the vulture stands for all who thrive through war. When Noah let the raven out to fly, it never did return, to signify such men whose souls are blackened by foul lust, or who, unkind, won't pay back trust with trust. The plodding puffball ostrich is that which figures all those weighed down with growing rich, and hearing God's call, plant their soiled head. Plovers, like gossips, on stray words are fed. And who, on seeing the gull, does not admire that its bright wings to heaven may aspire, and yet it wastes its hours adrift at sea, gorging on fishy sensuality. The hoopoe builds its nest on heaps of dung, just as despair's eyes view the world all wrong. He paused then at the thought of earthly sorrows, our sickly past, incarnadine tomorrows, the myriad things that whistle arcane truth to please old minds and to instruct raw youth, and bore down on his broken knees to pray for such a world that had so much to say. Read one last poem for you. Many of you will know that among the church fathers are several who wrote exclusively in verse. Ephraim the Syrian is perhaps the best known, but there's also Jacob of Sarug. And so here is a translation. Now, I know we're short on time, but I can't resist the temptation to the artist works out of a kind of holy ignorance, you might say. And one of the holy ignorances I was working out of was that I had no idea who Jacob of Sarug was when I came across a passage of his in my morning prayer. And I said, this is really good. It should be made a poem. And so I put it into verse, and then only later realized that it had started out a poem. That's the way I approach. And I put it back in the verse again. So my claims to originality are especially limited here, but that's okay because I never made claims to originality. This is a poem called Elizabeth to Her Cousin. Blessed are you, O maiden. Bless the fruit which dwells within your womb, beloved in that holy rest whose secret comes to sacred bloom. And blessed is this virgin birth which shall uproots in from the earth. Who grants this favor to me now, that you should come, O blessed one, bearing the great who is made low? By his own will this thing is done, the mother of a king, and yet it's at my wooden door we've met. Let every mouth speak out your praise, and all the seraphim stand shaken. Your womb contains the brilliant rays that from a living flame shall waken. This world whose sleep in sin-black night gives way before a new life and light. The gardener who clears the thorns, a lion's cub whose jaws shall roar, louder than all of Joshua's horns, and drive all craven wolves before. Such is the sun that all shall see, arise from you as from the sea. But who am I that you should come, bearing the one who made the world, who is its savior and its son, and yet within you now lies pearled? I am unfit, ancient of days, to welcome you or speak your praise. But lady, blessed and full of grace, I see your beauty and rejoice. The radiant flush upon your face, a living water in your voice, disclosing what alone you know, that light and word within you grow. No angel spoke this truth to me, but he who dwells within me stirred, the moment that my eyes could see your distant form, and my ear heard your call as down the hill you came, bearing that secret, ancient flame. Here. So what my comments today begin with that last line, that secret, ancient flame. The title of my remarks is Form as Ontological Secret, which some of you will know is a quotation from Marathon, and it's one I want to explore. I wanted to explore via those poems, but now I'll give you a bit of a reflection. So I have destined to appear sometime before the apocalypse a long essay called Jacques Maritain's Aesthetics Revisited, which a few people in this room got to hear a couple years ago in Dallas. And it's sort of a thorough reassessment of Maritain's writings on art and beauty. What I want to do today is just mention a few observations from that essay, but then develop one very narrow, particular, but I think very important strain of what Maritain says, and also a criticism I want to offer of it. So to begin, I think it's the case that Jacques Maritain's short book of 1920, Art and Scholasticism, to this day remains the necessary starting point for any discussion of the connection between the philosophy of art and beauty. It's a text of immense importance. And without trying to exhaust them, I want to just name 4 things that I find particularly valuable. And from the 3 presentations that I heard this morning, I'll be echoing some aspects of them. So the first one, to go back to Alice's comments from this morning, one of the things that Maritain does very well is to describe the virtue of art in terms of its external aim, the good of the work made. And he thus reconciles the fine artist with the artisan, as in he calls the fine artist to a humbler mode of being, the artist who would just make a good work, as he puts it. And yet, Maritain's description of that humble aim is one that very quickly will becomes clear is the humility, not just of the workman, but of Christ the carpenter, of the one who would, in fact, empty himself out for the good of the work. So wonderful, very French phrase from early in these chapters in Art Scholasticism, where he says, the ennui of living ceases at the door of every workshop. Mm-hmm. the fullness of our humanity goes away, and the artist is, as it were, lifted up in the act of doing his work. But that lifting up, and Meriton is quiet, subtle, but in no way overly subtle on this point. The artist is lifted up in a kind of ecstasy, giving himself over to the work to be made. But in so giving, it's an act of self-emptying. And I think this is actually, this aspect of Meriton's argument has an apologetic purpose. He's trying to reveal to the artist that they are already, in a certain sense, living for an end that is not their own. To live for the sake of the work to be made is analogous to, and you might say, a milestone on the pathway towards living for the sake of Christ, of not being one's own end. And so the artist is already performing a kind of kenosis of self-emptying in the workshop. And that's as true of the carpenter as it is of the fine artist. Another valuable insight, although one on which not enough can be said, is that his conception of art as a kind of knowing. And of particular value here is his situation of all things, according to the good Thomistic Dominican anthropology, of having the will and all of our faculties situated in the intellect. And the intellect as the specifically spiritual faculty that makes a rational animal, an intellectual being, capable of participating in being beyond itself, not outside of itself. As we heard in almost all of the presentations today, how that operates is still an open question. But the fact is that one of the important things that Meriton's doing here is restoring art to its proper seat of the intellect, and therefore drawing it away from any coarsely romantic account of art as an emotional expression. Third thing that art scholasticism does, and I think this is of immense value, though for some people here it will be an even more controversial claim than his account of art as knowing, is the recovery of beauty as a transcendental property of being. This is cited no little argumentation over the century and 5 years since it was first made by Meriton. And among the arguments is that Aquinas gives us no warrant to think of beauty as a transcendental property, to which Meriton in an endnote replies, he doesn't really reply by anticipation. He says quite boldly, one of the endnotes to art of scholasticism, in truth, beauty is the radiance of all the transcendental properties united. There's no textual basis for him saying that, but I think that is an absolutely true claim. And I'll say more about that in just a few minutes. But recovery, just the very act of trying to recover beauty as a transcendental property of being was a great gift of that book. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly for the book to its original audience, is his recovery of poiesis, the act of making, and of the fine art act of poiesis in particular, as having as its end beauty, and the recognition that by the very manifestation of a form for the sake of beauty, that the artist in so making is directed finally towards the source of all beauty, God, whose divine name is beauty, and that the recipient of the work of art, the one who enters into the contemplation of the work of art, is also on a path that converges ultimately in infinity with the divine beauty itself. And so taking seriously the possibility that poetry could reveal, that works of art through their beauty could reveal the divine while not becoming a substitute revelation. And for those who have really gotten into the weeds of Meriton's early writings, his his great interlocutor is as for most Catholic writers in the early 20th century in France is Arthur Rimbaud, because Rimbaud had credited poetry as a substitute for religion, and then when it failed, he said poetry's crap, quit, became a slave trader, died of a gunshot wound. It's a long story. Anyways, but the important thing is that the failure of Rimbaud to realize his religious and spiritual mission in poetry was a great cause of controversy in French culture. And so Maritain took a very unusual route at the time, which was to say Rimbaud was right. Poetry is intrinsically spiritual. It leads to the absolute. It leads to God. Well, then why did it fail, you ask? Without grace, nothing is possible. Just as we can perceive God as being itself by the natural reason alone, but that is not the knowledge of God that saves, so we can perceive God as the divine beauty, but it's only with grace that we can leap into the personhood of that beauty and be saved. And this, for Maritain, both Maritains, Jacques and Raissa, was a quintessential thing to recognize about the telos of the work of art. And I'll just say one more word about that, because it's always good to use a word from mathematics when one is practically enumerate, as I am in conversation. The crucial term for him is that that beauty is asymptotic. An asymptote is a curve that convenes that meets a line only at an infinite point. And such is the case with beauty. It leads us asymptotically towards the infinite, but it's only grace that can leap it into the infinite. Okay, so there's the positive contribution of art scholasticism. Here are a few brief criticisms responding to each point. One is this. In art scholasticism, Maritain does a wonderful job contrasting the classical understanding of habitus, a connatural disposition towards virtue, with Cartesian method. Maritain even tells us a wonderful history could be written of the expurgation of habitus from the modern mind in favor of method. And indeed, that book has been written many times, including by Maritain and his other writings. To take art seriously as a habitus means that while it may have rules, it can't be subject to the rules. The rules are rather subject to the excellence of the virtue. And I think that's the case. Unfortunately, I think Maritain's discussion of it becomes somewhat obscurantist, as if to suggest, as Kant will put it, that the artist simply gives the rule to art. And I think that risks confusing things a bit. Second of all, as I said, Maritain is right to resituate the virtue of art in the intellect, and coming to an understanding of art as a way of knowing and as a participant in the many different ways of knowing which human beings are capable, I think is absolutely essential to understanding what art does. For my part, I would simply say, and I know this is another lecture in itself, but for my part, I would simply say that art is simply one of the things human beings do in response to the gift of being, and that the opening pages of Aristotle's Metaphysics make this clear, that the mind stretches out towards knowing in wonder. The only reason the mind stretches out towards knowing in wonder is because the world, being itself, is first given to us as wonderful. You can't wonder about what's not wonderful. Otherwise, there'd be nothing to wonder about. So resituating all human activity, including the activity of the artist, as a response to this first gift of being, I think is something that must be done. Maritain does something like that, but in my view, in a somewhat unsatisfactory form, and Alice said a lot about this morning, where he'll eventually convene upon the theory of creative intuition or poetic knowledge as an obscure, intuitive grasp of the self and things within the self. For my part, I think that's probably a very accurate description of how Maritain's best friend and favorite artist, Georges Rouault, painted. But I think the applicability probably stops with Rouault. and it's not generalizable. And if you won't take my word for it, when Meriton first articulated these things, T.S. Eliot replied to the pages of the Criterion, "Artists, do not read this book. It's messy with mysteries that you have no business thinking about." Okay. Next bit of criticism, and this will be actually the focus of my last few remarks today, is that he gathers the texts, the great texts from the classical and the Christian tradition on the nature of beauty, and lays them before us and leaves them there for us. And it's a great gift in this book. I counted at one point, and that's in my book, The Vision of the Soul, like the exact count, I'm forgetting now. I think there's 78 citations from the Summa, or from Aquinas in Art and Scholasticism, which is a lot for a very short book. And many of them he just cites and moves on. And he's left, therefore, the historian who writes his book by tracing the footnotes of prior historians, Meriton's sort of done that for us. He's left such a good series of passages in Aquinas that we can sort of retrace his steps and go a little further than he wants to go. I think he doesn't fully assess the implications of many of those passages. And the result, and I mean this as both praise and criticism, is that his account of the arts of the beautiful, the fine arts, is actually more Platonic than he realizes. But then finally, one last brief criticism. Meriton's last word on the arts is not to be found in art scholasticism. It's not to be found in the great essay he wrote subsequently, The Frontiers of Poetry. It's not to be found in his book, The Situation of Poetry, or The Morality of the Artist. It sort of all culminates in his grand book that I mentioned at the outset, Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry. And what I would propose is that whereas Meriton begins so brilliantly with understanding this asymptotic nature of the fine arts as ordered to the absolute of beauty, and therefore reaching out without being capable of touching the face of God, that he becomes so preoccupied with the way in which art might be a kind of knowing that he digs ever more deeply into the psychology of the artist and moves away from, I think, the great metaphysical insights with which he begins. And so there's a lot of, you might say, unexploited promise still lying in Meriton. But it's that third part. How has he developed his thinking on beauty as a transcendental that I'm going to look at? And we'll do it just by reading one paragraph of Meriton. For those of you who know your editions in the Joseph Evans translation of Art Scholasticism. That was a yes, right? Not a shaking to the head. Okay, yes. The Joseph Evans translation. This is on page 26. And it's really, if you take nothing else away from this morning, or this afternoon, just take this quotation, which is so. If beauty delights the intellect, it is because it is essentially a certain excellence or perfection in the proportion of things to the intellect. Hence the three conditions St. Thomas assigned to beauty: integrity, because the intellect is pleased in fullness of being; proportion, because the intellect is pleased in order and unity; finally, and above all, radiance or clarity, because the intellect is pleased in light and intelligibility. A certain splendor is, in fact, according to all the ancients, the essential characteristics of beauty. Claritas est de ratione pulchritudinis, lux pulchrificat, that's a hard one for me, quias sine luce omnia sunt turpia. But it is a splendor of intelligibility. Splendor varies, said the Platonists. Splendor ordinus, said St. Augustine, adding that unity is the form of all beauty. Splendor formae, said St. Thomas, in his precise metaphysician's language. For the form, that is to say, the principle which constitutes the proper perfection of all that is, which constitutes and achieves things in their essences and qualities, which, finally, if one may so put it, the ontological, which is, finally, if one may so put it, the ontological secret that they bear within them, their spiritual being, their operating mystery, the form indeed is above all the proper principle of intelligibility, the proper clarity of everything. Besides, every form is a vestige or ray of the creative intelligence imprinted at the heart of creative being. If we had 45 minutes, we could just go through this sentence by sentence, and that would be an entire metaphysics of beauty. I'm going to offer just a few quick comments. Beginning with Plato's Symposium and Phaedrus, we get in rough and ready form the classical definition of beauty, which is the splendor of form, or form plus splendor. Maritain points out to us that that's one of the ancient acceptations, and that this has something to do with order and unity. And then he unfolds at breakneck speed St. Thomas's mentioning of the three conditions of beauty, before culminating in a vision of beauty as leading to the divine. The ray of creative intelligence of God is imprinted in creative being, and so to perceive the beauty of creative being is in a very real sense, for the mind to begin its movement back towards God. All of this I agree with. Where I think we get a weakness is in the phrase that I used as my title, when he speaks of form as ontological secret. This leads Maritain in directions that I think his favorite painter Rouault, his second favorite Maurice Denis, may lead him astray to some extent. In what sense? What Maritain unfolds in art and scholasticism is something I would describe as an overly iconic definition of art. And I was moved by my fellow Michigander, David Clayton's comment this morning. That's actually a thing. That's true. But we'll go with that. Maybe the question and answer session. But anyhow, but about the idea of mimesis and the I forget the term you used, but the deviation from mere photographic realism. Yes, and so that occurs, and for Maritain's part, he takes this idea of the necessary deviation of the work of fine art in a curious direction. When he turns to Aquinas's three conditions of beauty, integrity, proportion, and clarity, he actually has very little to say about either integrity or proportion. He's just so excited. He just wants to move right on to claritas. And the reason he does it is because he doesn't think beauty can appear. He thinks form is an ontological secret. And I can't help but think this is not a great place to start if we're going to talk about form. So I remember teaching philosophy of science years ago. I had my students reading Aristotle's Physics, and I said, okay, let's review. Who can tell me what form means for Aristotle? And there were a series of befuddled looks, and one of my students finally said, shape? Yeah, it is. The form of a triangle is triangular. But is man a featherless biped? No, he's a rational animal. So but can you appear a rational animal? Not exactly. So Maritain's in some sense right that form doesn't appear. Form is an ontological secret. It's interior. But form also does appear. And this is the whole mystery of beauty. That the invisible becomes visible, and that the visible leads us towards the invisible. Maritain put off, for what reason I do not know, by the brilliant academicism of the French painter Bouguereau, was not willing to believe that there could be much continuity between the visible and the invisible. So he insults Bouguereau, but he favors Rouault and Denis and other modern painters, and we can see what he's after there. For those of you who know of Rouault Face of Christ or Crucifixion, by sheer dumb luck, I was standing next to a Rouault crucifixion about 6 months ago, and I said to the owner of the house, "Oh, where did you get this lovely print?" And to which she replied, "I did not buy a print. I bought that from the Museum of Modern Art for $1.2 million. So I backed away quickly. For fear I would spill my wine on it. But anyhow, but we see what's happening there in Rouault. Rouault disfigures surface. He disintegrates. He disproportions appearance in hopes that iconically the claritas might shine out. And this is certainly a mode of being. Where would art be without the icon? But it's not the sole mode of the fine arts. It's too narrow, but for Maritana becomes a type. The error I think he makes is he doesn't take those three conditions of beauty from Aquinas back to their very obscure source, which is in Aquinas's commentary on the divine names by Pseudo-Dionysius, or Dionysius as his friends call him. From Dionysius, we can discern that when Aquinas introduces integrity, proportion, and claritas as the conditions of beauty, as a definition of beauty, as a form of beauty, that he's not doing something different from the classical account of beauty as form plus splendor. He's simply interpreting it. And here's what I mean by that. For Dionysius, and I believe for Aquinas through him, the encounter with integrity, as Maritain himself says, is the presence of wholeness. The experience of existent form disclosing itself. But no form, no man is an island, and no form exists in vacuo. All beings are part of universal being, and it's in consequence of that the world is intelligible. It delivers ratios to us. We can even correlate things like elephants and giraffes and see the relationships between them, however different they may seem. And this is that property of proportion, the way we begin to see individual beings disclosing themselves and giving themselves away in intellectual, spiritual relationships with other beings. So proportion is the relationship of the integrity of the existent form to universal being. But deeper and earlier in us than even our own being is the causality of our being by God's creative act. And so embedded nearer to us than we are to ourselves, as Augustine would put it, embedded at the center of our being is our being creatures first. And so you cannot see a single creature without being reminded of the creator. I'm told that Elizabeth Anscombe, when she was having many children, somebody put on the chalkboard, Anscombe breeds. Is this a true story? And she walked in and added to the chalkboard, immortal beings. Anscombe breeds immortal beings. And that this is exactly the thing that we see when we encounter the claritas of beauty, the reminder that this thing here only is because it was first loved by God. And these are the three conditions of beauty. So speaking of three, I've left you 3 minutes for questions. Thank you.